Another rough week on Wall Street, and the March jobs report out today didn't help all that much. The Dow set to close out the day in the red. MSNBC host David Gura joins me now. And David, that March jobs report started off the day on a real low note. The U.S. lost more than 700,000 jobs in March, and that is probably not the full picture, especially when you look at the weekly jobless claims we've been seeing.
Yeah, you got to keep that in mind. This is in part based on a survey that was taken in the first half of March, on March the 12th. And as we know, the bulk of the job losses that we've seen recently happened in the latter part of March. So it's not capturing that whole picture at all. Still, that number is a devastating number. And like so many of the data points that we've seen over these last few weeks, it is showing what is likely to be a worsening U.S. economy. And a number of economists at major banks, at Bank of America, at Morgan Stanley today, we're out with new forecasts for joblessness, new forecasts for GDP as well. Some of them had some optimism that in the fourth quarter this year, we'd see an uptick in GDP. But overall, huge drops over the course of this year. Morgan Stanley even forecasting that we're not going to get back to a stable U.S. economy, the likes of which we saw before this virus, until 2021. And that, of course, coincident with what a lot of scientists are saying about how long it'll take to develop a vaccine that's going to tackle this virus. So you're right, that jobs number going into the weekend, just another indication of how bad things are going, at least in part, and something it's incredibly sobering as we look at those weekly numbers and see record after record, 2 weeks of record-breaking numbers, more than 6 million applications, first-time applications for unemployment insurance yesterday, Allison.
Yeah, and then, David, of course, we heard from New York Governor Andrew Cuomo about a spike in coronavirus deaths, in New York State. We know this is happening. We know we still haven't reached the peak in New York State yet. But you hear that news, it's still really sobering, and that certainly didn't help the markets today either.
No, and we got to keep in mind here that investors are really paying attention to the science, talking to investors, talking to economists. You get the sense that they're all studying the public health literature at this point, listening to folks like Governor Andrew Cuomo to see what the latest is on this virus and on mitigating this virus. Everyone to a T said to me, we can't have any sort of recovery from this until we see that curve flatten, until we see that mitigation effort working. So when you get an announcement like the one that we got from the governor today, it's just another data point that investors see as an indication that this is very much still with us, very much all-encompassing, very much something that they're going to have to pay attention to as these weeks drag on. This is a waiting game. And what's frustrating, I think, for investors, for economists, for folks who are looking at the U.S. economy is this doesn't mirror past crises that we've seen in this country. They are dependent on the science. They're dependent on the discovery of a vaccine, of some way to mitigate what's happening here medically. And to an extent, that means that investors' hands are tied, Allison.
David, I know you've been looking very closely at oil prices and the wild ride that they've been on recently. They might have been the only bright spot today, huh?
Yeah, the heads of some major energy companies meeting with the president of the United States today at his invitation at the White House. Interesting to see who was invited, some major producers and some independent producers as well. There's no unanimity among them. Oil prices or they have been incredibly low. You're right. They were up about 11, 12% today on news that the president seems willing to mediate or engage with the two parties that are engaged in a price war at this point, Saudi Arabia and Russia. But every analyst that I talk to about the oil industry says, if this isn't a sideshow, it's one part of a larger story here. And that is this massive imbalance between supply and demand. There is so much oil in the global marketplace right now and not enough buyers. And for a while, this was a story that was happening in parallel to what was happening with the coronavirus. But we've seen them converge in these recent weeks because as we're staying home, as we're following instructions from the government not to go out, not to drive places, to remain where we live, folks aren't driving. So that demand, which had been so depressed, is now even worse than it was before. And, something that's interesting to watch here is storage capacity. It's something the president talks a lot about as he opines on where oil prices are at this point. He's right. There is a limit to where you can store all this excess oil. And yes, oil prices are up today, but they're still incredible lows. And so for producers who want to hold on to that oil before they sell it, their options are limited. And I was just kind of marveling at something today. A couple weeks back, the president, during one of those afternoon press conferences that coincided with the market close, said offhandedly he wanted to buy a ton of oil cheap, essentially to put in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve as sort of a benefit to the country. Reportedly, that hasn't happened. And you have that reserve now leasing space, renting space to producers to the tune of about 72 million barrels, saying, we have a place for you to put that oil while we ride this out. Again, though, with this much production, the way that we ride this out maybe in part is dealing with this price war between these two sovereign producers, but there's a lot more to play here. Some producers are going to have to reduce or curb the production that they have, Allison.
Yeah. David, yeah, you've been mentioning storage space here, and I know I've been pretty bad. I've been promising I was going to update this bookshelf to try to compete with you a little bit here, and I have not done my job. But I just have to let you know, I got myself a tiny desk, and I know you of all people would appreciate that. So we got a tiny desk. We'll work on the bookshelves. We'll work on our storage.
The weekend awaits, and I'm grateful for your sweater reminding me that, in fact, it is Friday. I feel very lost not knowing what day of the week it is. I appreciate that.
Same here. It's why I'm wearing them. You made it through the week. Thanks for all your updates on the markets for us. We really appreciate it, David.
Got it. Be well, Allison. Thanks.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.